Good morning. Welcome to week 5 in our elementary social studies content course. This week we're going to be taking a look at the 1800s and what I call westward conquest. I prefer to use the term westward conquest instead of westward expansion because in my mind, again, maybe I'm splitting hairs, but when we talk about expansion, it means there's room for growth because there's nothing out there, as opposed to looking at, historically speaking, how it was that the United States was able to move westward. So to do that, before we get started, I want to focus our attention on several things, focus questions that I want us to reflect back on. And again, these aren't content-oriented questions. These are more for you to reflect on and make meaning out of the things that you're going to be reading this week in the chapter and the things that you're going to be reading about in Zinn. And so the questions are this: what do we really make of the progress that we made? And by we, I mean the United States. This is oftentimes a time period in history that's called a time of great progress in America. We expanded, our economies grew, our population grew. But what do we really make of that progress? And then more importantly, what did it cost for the United States to become the country that it has become? Because what price was paid? And who paid that price? Was it really the United States? Was it really the United States citizens who paid the price for this expansion, for this conquest, for this progress that was made? I'm not sure. I don't know. And so I want us to think about a couple of these things, really focusing in on there was a price that was paid, but who paid it? Now, the 1800s, the early 1800s, were a time of immense growth and immense change in the United States early on, and then particularly towards the end of the 1800s as well. I'm going to focus really on the 1800s as a whole, sort of give you a brief history of the early 1800s. Then we're going to skip a really important event sort of in the middle in the 1860s. It's the American Civil War. Because really America turned its focus from looking westward and we started focusing inward and saying, how are we going to preserve the Union? So there wasn't a lot of expansion going on during the Civil War. And then again, we're going to focus in on post-1860 to about 1900. So we're really going to look at 1800 to about, 1850 or so, and then again from about 1865 to about 1900, skipping the Civil War, because we're going to focus in specifically on that event next week because it's such a big event. So I want to think a little bit about the expansion and what's going on in the 1800s. Now, in the early 1800s, there was a lot of changes going on. There was a new American intellectualism that was taking place. Writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Emily Dickinson, all writing from this American perspective. And then this new movement called Transcendentalism, spearheaded by people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Margaret Fuller, and Henry David Thoreau. An important note is Thoreau is the guy who pioneered peaceful civil disobedience and protest. He was a major influence on later people in the 20th century like Gandhi and then particularly Martin Luther King Jr. There was a massive change and a uniqueness in the landscape as people moved westward, particularly trying to be captured through painters and conservationists like John Muir, who convinced people like President Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, to set aside vast tracts of land to set up our national parks, which national parks have been in the news right now. So that's what's going on early on in the United States. And throughout the 1800s, what we have to know is that the United States would continue to grow and expand westward. So where is it that we got this massive tract of land? Well, if you remember back to the early 1800s, under President Jefferson, Jefferson acquired the land from France through what we call the Louisiana Purchase. He purchased the Louisiana Territory and bought from France, obtaining Florida from Spain, and then basically buying all of the Midwest and what we would call the West from France because France needed the cash. Then Jefferson sent out the famous duo Lewis and Clark to explore and discover what's out there, what did we buy, and what can we use it for. And so you have this idea then starting in the early 1800s, a fancy term known as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny can be best defined as this idea that God has ordained that we have a given right to expand from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, that God has ordained that Americans have the right to explore, settle, and use the land in the West. Now, notice how we view it as our God given right, and yet we don't focus on who's out there. There are people out there. Where is this land? Who has been out there before us? And what we're going to see is throughout the 1800s, the expansion into the West leads to this conflict between Americans and the Native Americans. And it always settles around land ownership. Here's why. It is a very Western European or Westward civilization or American understanding about land ownership. That's a very Western way of thinking. You and I understand that when I say I live on a farm or I live on an acreage and I have 10 acres of land, you understand what that means. The fascinating thing is that linguistically, Native Americans, Indians, they did not have, in any of the native languages, there was not a word for land ownership. It was not a concept that they understood. Not that they couldn't understand it, it's that they didn't even have a word for land ownership. So when the French and the English settle in North America, when the Americans want to expand westward and they want to talk about land ownership, it's literally an unknown foreign concept to the Native Americans because it wasn't even in their vocabulary. So the fighting that we see occurring throughout the 1800s is over land. That battle is still going on. Look at the pipeline that's going on that just came through Iowa. It's being stopgapped at places in North Dakota. Why? Because of land ownership. It's still an issue that is at the heart of this tension that is between the United States government and Native Americans. And so that really becomes the idea that is at the heart of this issue. It's over land ownership. And the idea of manifest destiny expanding and growing, that continued on into the 1840s when we look at it spread into Texas. When we gained Texas from Mexico, we eventually went to war, gaining massive tracts of land, which I'll show you. I'll just show you real quick right now as I kind of jump around. We continue into the 1840s, 1850s. We go to war with Mexico. It's really in the war with Mexico that a bunch of our very famous Civil War generals and future presidents gain experience to fight in this American Civil War. This shows you in the left-hand side what was Mexico's. After the Mexican War, this is what we had obtained. You could make a solid argument for the war with Mexico really being a massive land grab. And I believe that Howard Zinn really makes that point as well. The war with Mexico was nothing more than a massive land grab. Expansion continues into the West and into places outside of the United States as well. But in the West, you have the Oregon Territory being acquired from Britain. Eventually, we gain Hawaii. Then we buy Alaska from Russia. Remember, that's called Seward's Folly. And then eventually we fight a war, the Spanish-American War, over land in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So when we talk about American history in the 1800s, it really truly is about conquest. It really truly is about expansion and this idea of manifest destiny, that God has ordained us to take all of this land. Now, interestingly enough, throughout the 1800s, like we talked about with expansion, and as we move into looking at this idea, there's really a painting, and it was painted later on. It was painted in 1872, but I really believe that this painting sort of signifies the idea that Americans had. This painting was by John Gass, and it was called American Progress. And I want to focus in on this in a moment. But before 1840, most Americans viewed the land west Mississippi as basically a great, untamed, dangerous wilderness. It was rugged, it was extreme, wild animals, and hostile natives. Interestingly, though, when you look at historically, they believe that less than maybe 400 people were actually killed by Native Americans. So the whole concept of, fighting the natives as we expand westward and circling the wagons to fend off these savage Indians, it's not historically accurate. But beginning in 1840, an ever-growing number of farmers, miners, ranchers, businessmen, adventurers moved west. By the 1870s, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad and soaring demand for Western products and resources drastically increased this westward expansion. The painting by Gast here it's a celebratory scene and kind of unintentional, but it reveals the bitter conflict that accompanied the transformation of the West. If you look at the left-hand side, let's look at this painting a moment. And here's where would be a good place where you could pause the video for 30 seconds and look. What is it that you notice in this video? I would pause here and take 30 seconds to note it, to point out, what do you notice? Now, what stands out to you? What's the first thing that we see? This is a great technique to use with kids and when you have them examining paintings. Let's take a look. If you look closely in the painting, look to the right. The sun is shining. The telephone wire is being drugged by this woman. You have trains coming this way. You have farmers and businessmen and wagons moving west. And look, on the right-hand side is light. On the right-hand side is technology. On the right-hand side is advancement and progress. And look west. What do you see on the left-hand side? What do you see on the left? You see savage Indians killing animals. You see darkness. You see clouds. This painting truly symbolizes that idea that when we move west, the Americans brought progress. We brought civilization. We brought everything good that mankind had invented thus far, and we were taming the West. This painting shows that. And I think it's fascinating that that Gast wanted to point that out to us as a way of explaining this westward expansion. Now, in the westward expansion, what we see happening, and it's like I've made reference to before, this led to major issues with relations with the natives. Already in the early 1800s, under Andrew Jackson, you have the Westward Settlement, the Indian Removal Act, in I believe it was 1829, that forcibly moved the natives west of the Mississippi. Now remember, when you were looking at it, when we moved the Indians out as America expanded over the Appalachian Mountains post the American Revolution, we said we would not ever move them again. And yet here you have Andrew Jackson, who was aided by the natives in fighting his wars, which made him popular. We have this notion that now they have no right to be in what is now the United States, so we forcibly move them west. That forcible movement was known as the Trail of Tears. And that was the movement of the Cherokee under Andrew Jackson because of the Indian Removal Act, which moved them all westward. Then you have big events coming with the Civil War. The United States puts westward expansion and our relations with the Indians on hold. We focus in on the Civil War. But then after the Civil War, you have many, many soldiers and generals and people who they have no employment left. They've only known making war. Many of them fought in the war with Mexico and then the win to the Civil War. And so you have all these people who need employment, these former soldiers. So they go west to subdue the West and wage war on the Indians. The Army, we tried to move them off in the Black Hills, interestingly, in the 1870s. And it's fascinating now that we're still interacting with the natives in the West, in the Black Hills. But in 1876, gold was discovered there. And a very famous general moved out there. His name was George Armstrong Custer. And Custer moves out and tries to make war against the Sioux and the Cheyenne. This results in the Battle of Little Bighorn, where Custer fought against Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, known as Custer's Last Stand. And this was the most devastating defeat the United States ever suffered at the hands of Native Americans. But it really symbolizes and sounds the death knell for Native American resistance. Because post this, the United States threw everything it had into waging war against the Indians. You have by 1886, Geronimo fighting a war of against expansion, and again you have other massacres taking place: the massacre at Sand Creek, the massacre at Wounded Knee in South Dakota, um, and a great place to look for this is in your text. I believe it's around page 36 or 37 is a great place to sort of summarize these events here. But there's a really moving statement by Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce that summarized the view of this almost this lost cause that the natives were fighting. And he said something to the effect of, "I'm tired of fighting. My heart is sad. From where the sun stands, I will fight no more." And while that was said before the last Native Americans surrendered, it really does a good job of summarizing the view of the Native Americans. If you're interested at this topic at all, I've recommended this book before, but it truly is a fascinating tale. It's the book by D. Brown, known as Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's an Indian history of the American West. It is bar none one of the most fascinating stories, and it's of American conquest, and it is told from the perspective of the natives. It was one of the most eye-opening texts I've ever read in terms of westward conquest, westward expansion. And so when you look at all of this, I have to come back to that question. What was the cost of our progress that was made? What was the price? And who paid that price? Now, what's fascinating is that the natives, as early as the Cherokee in the 1820s, were doing everything that they could to try to be more American. Even before we waged war in post-Civil War, they were trying to do everything they could to be American, to be Western European, to look, to act, to think like Americans. I want to do a brief exercise again, something like what we did with the painting. I'm going to show you a picture, and I want you to look at it and then pause it and compare and contrast what you see. Note the differences, note the similarities. Here you have two pictures of two figures from American history. What are some similarities and what are some differences that you notice? If you resume, here are some similarities and some differences that I notice. Similarities: they're dressed the same, they have the same outfits on, they're both sitting at a desk, they both have paper and writing, I believe implying intellectualism, business-like manner. I believe it states some sort of authority. Now the figure on the left, does anybody know who that is? That is Andrew Jackson. The figure on the right, does anybody know who that is? That is the chief of the Cherokee Nation in the 1820s. I'll say it again. The man on the right is the chief of the Cherokee Nation in the 1820s. His name was, I think, John Ross was his name. The man here with the shirt and tie and writing, just like the president on the left, was the chief. He's not wearing feathers. He's not in a loincloth. He's not riding a horse screaming and whooping across the plains. He is an intellectual. He is a businessman, and he argued using the court systems of the United States to try to keep the Cherokee on their land. And because he was Indian, they denied him that. What was the price of progress? What was the price, and who paid it? I really want to think high level here. And I, like I said before, I believe westward expansion and progress does not adequately describe and share the viewpoints if you are incorporating the native perspective. Think high level summary again of how it was that we moved west. And all of this can best be summarized as we look at the tragic story in D. Brown. And as you read through the text briefly, looking at all the many different interactions that we had, all hostile towards the natives, up through and around the 1890s. So America made progress. America grew. America expanded. but at what cost? At what price? And who paid that price? Have a great week, everybody.